war in the name of God. The great world religions preach peace and mercy. History, especially the history of the Middle Ages, proves that religion and violence are not contradictions. A belief in God often means believing in fighting on behalf of God and in being rewarded in paradise. Islam means peace. Christ teaches us to love our enemy, but in their names, the world wages war. The unique and triumphal expansion of Islam has made it the religion of many peoples from Spain to Indonesia. But there is no Islamic Empire, just as there is no Christian Empire. Everywhere in the Middle Ages there are wars among princes and tribes. For half a century there have been crusades to the Holy Land. After Islam, Christianity too spreads to every corner of the world. The center of Islamic civilization is Baghdad, the most magnificent city on earth. Not a holy place like Mecca and Medina, but a worldly Arabian capital city, like this one, a metropolis.
At the
end of the 8th century, Baghdad had become the center of the world. No other city could compare with this splendid capital. The centers of learning, the academies, the hospitals, the baths. Everything was perfect.
The real threat to the worldly empire of Allah does not come from Europe. For 2 centuries, the Crusaders only threatened the coastal areas. The Christians want Jerusalem. That is what they are fighting for, with little success. For the Islamic empires, the Crusaders are a problem only on their borders. It is not a clash of civilizations. The real threat to Islam comes from the steppes of Asia. Like a natural disaster, the Mongols fall upon their enemies, merciless, annihilating, unbeatable. They bring no superior culture with them, only brutality. In 1258, Baghdad falls into their hands.
The Mongols were much worse than their predecessors in Baghdad. Basically, they possessed no culture and simply destroyed everything in their path. At first, there was some religious tolerance, but the second phase of the Mongol rule was dreadful.
The Mongols, mounted nomads, their wealth, herds of cattle. Revenge is their prime mover. Over the ages, the Mongols have lived by perfecting their herding skills. Drive the cattle together, cut the ones you want out of the herd, slaughter them. This turns them into perfect soldiers. In 1260, at Ain Chalut, they are defeated by the Arabs for the first time in history. They are forced to withdraw. The myth is destroyed.
Das ist ja das Interessante bei den Mongolen gewesen. Sie sind ziemlich schnell.
The really interesting thing about the Mongols is that they come storming over the horizon and conquer the Islamic territories pretty quickly, meaning that there's no time to evaluate the threat.
Angerichteten Schaden mustern konnte.
These Mongol rulers adapted relatively quickly to the local population, with the result that after only 40 years, the first Mongol empire on Islamic territory, the empire of the Ikhana, has already become Islamic.
Auch nach 40 Jahren schon ein islamisches Reich geworden.
Even today, Ain Chalut is the subject of heroic sagas and legends. The end of Mongol rule. But the real triumph is still greater. In only 2 generations, the mounted warriors who almost conquered Islam have themselves become Muslims. The Book of Allah is mightier than the Mongols' perfect military machine. Up to this point, the history of Islam has been a chain of amazing success. The story begins in the Arabian desert, in Mecca, with an orphan boy. In the year 569, in what is now Saudi Arabia, Muhammad is born. After losing both parents, he grows up with his uncle and becomes a merchant and caravan leader. Then signs. A Christian monk foretells that Muhammad will become a prophet, and more than that, he will be the last, the ultimate prophet. He marries a 40-year-old woman, unusual for the time. It's a good marriage. His tribe, the Quraysh, worship holy trees, stones, and many gods. When Muhammad is already over 40, the angel Gabriel appears to him for the first time. Muhammad, who is illiterate, receives a revelation from the angel in the form of the Quran. According to Islamic belief, the words of the Quran have always existed before the beginning of time with God. The Quran is holy and unchangeable. Through it, Arabic, the language of a few desert tribes, will spread like the wind. The words of the Quran are so masterful, so forceful, that to this day they represent Arabic poetry in its most perfect form.
Man hat sogar schon einmal
It has even been said that the position of the Quran in Islam can really only be compared to the position of Jesus Christ in Christianity. Insofar as in Christianity, God became man, became flesh, incarnation, whereas in Islam, God became a book. So we can speak of an inlibration.
Gott Buch geworden ist. Und insofern spricht man auch von einer Inlibration.
To Muhammad are revealed the 5 pillars of Islam. There is no God but God, and Muhammad is his prophet. Every day, 5 prayers, alms for the poor, fasting during Ramadan, and the pilgrimage to Mecca. Muhammad is the last prophet, a perfect man, but still only a man. There are 28 prophets in the Quran, among them Adam and Abraham. For Muslims, Jesus is one of the prophets. Like Maria, he has a rather special place in the Quran, is known as the word and breath of Allah, and after his death is lifted up to God. Muslims do not believe in his crucifixion, saying that another was crucified in place of the prophet Jesus. The closely related Christian and Jewish religions were allowed to be practiced in Islamic empires. Christianity was similarly tolerant only in the later Crusader states.
There was
certainly an indirect awareness of certain common elements. For instance, from the early Middle Ages onwards, there are texts which repeatedly point out that, of course, Muslims too go all the way back to a common progenitor, Abraham. But that was not always seen as a positive argument or as representing a positive attitude towards Muslims. Perhaps it wouldn't be going too far to say that the Muslim religion was too similar to Christianity, and out of this similarity developed a degree of rivalry. If you want a comparison, consider that within Christianity, the nonconformists, the heretics, are often viewed as worse enemies than the proponents of a totally different religious community.
Angehörige einer ganz anderen Glaubensgemeinschaft.
After an initial period of rejection, Islam spreads throughout Arabia with increasing rapidity. In the year 632, Muhammad dies. He has no son. A quarrel breaks out about his successor, the Caliph. Shortly afterwards, Muslims split up into Sunnis, who believe that any devout Muslim can become their religious leader, and Shiites, who only recognized the leadership of direct descendants of Muhammad's family. The new faith, and with it Arabic, the language of the Quran, spreads over the next 300 years with immense speed to the distant borders of the known world, where, for the most part, it still dominates today. Islam is not a pacifist religion. Muhammad was a prophet, a successful merchant, and a military leader. Muslims may answer violence with violence. Their young, unspent religion makes them into good warriors. But Islam is not a religion of holy war. Right from the start, even in battles, there are moderating rules of conduct, for example, concerning the treatment of women and children. The term holy war is adopted by Muslims in the Middle Ages from Christians. Jihad means more than fighting the infidels.
Jihad ist
Jihad is a noun from the verb jada, which means simply to make an effort. This is firstly an inner effort, an injunction to come to terms with oneself, together with a Platonic world-view that one must strive for self-improvement for the sake of one's religion. It's inner, but also outer-directed, and therefore means to fight, the fight being directed purely outwards. Of course, that's very early. Both meanings become current very early on, though the Shiites, who are very important here, particularly emphasize the inner struggle, describing it as the first, the highest jihad. In other words, a Muslim must improve himself.
Das heißt also, der Muslim hat sich zu verbessern.
In the early Middle Ages, the different Arab tribes and clans are bitter enemies. They buy slaves, mostly children of the non-Muslim Turkic peoples, and train them as elite Islamic warriors. This military enslavement becomes typical for Islam. These slave soldiers reach the highest ranks, and finally, many of them actually come to rule over the dynasties. It is often stated that the reason for this law is the Quran, which forbids Muslims from fighting against Muslims. But this commandment is broken from the very beginning.
Diese Militärsklaven sind eigentlich
The military slaves are introduced for the first time in the Abbasid Empire, then later in the Mamluk dynasty, which was in fact maintained by these military slaves, as was the Sultanate of Delhi.
Dieses Militärsklavensystem ist vielleicht eine Reaktion gewesen.
This system of slavery is perhaps a reaction to the fact that in the early days of Islam, when rulers depended on mounted nomads who were organized tribally, they, the rulers, had problems with conflicting tribal loyalties.
Tribal organisiert waren, dass sie dort das Problem hatten.
Whereas if they depended on slaves, whom they had raised themselves and given them a career, then they could count on absolute loyalty.
Dann, die sie selbst hochgezogen hatten, denen sie selbst eine Karriere verschafft hatten, dann konnten sie mit absoluter Loyalität rechnen.
The most famous ruler of a military slave dynasty is the legendary Saladin. Saladin is a Kurd and rules in Egypt from 1171. His Turkish Mamluk guards, Mamluk means slave, will later defeat the Mongols at Ain Chalut. The system of military slaves continues even after the Middle Ages. The Turkish Janissary Guards were recruited from 20,000 Russian and African children purchased every year. Christians had to surrender every fifth child to the Ottoman Empire. 800 AD, the victorious military expansion of Islam brings with it not only war and the new faith, but also superior scientific knowledge and an advanced culture. The Arabs have become a seafaring nation. They make new discoveries in the fields of mathematics, astronomy, cartography and navigation, optics, chemistry, physics and medicine. Muslim Arabs now produce the best scientists of the Middle Ages. The instruction in the Quran to pray in the direction of Mecca at certain hours demands a precise knowledge of time and orientation. Sailors navigating towards a fixed destination are more interested in practical theories than in theological correctness. The Arabs learn from every culture they encounter. Their scholars discover the works of the Greek philosophers. The result is a unique flowering of knowledge, culture, and intellectual freedom. Arabic poetry, viewed with mistrust by the Quran, is a further driving force in this development. From this time, we have inherited such words as cipher, zero, algorithm, zenith, and our numbers. Surprisingly, the Arabic word for this process is linked to the concept of jihad.
Ijtihad simply means to cultivate, to make fruitful everything one touches. In religion, in all disciplines, when one thinks of the great theologies, that means one must seek to innovate, not just to receive knowledge. This is shown in science and philosophy. They didn't merely take from the philosophy of the ancient Greeks, Plato, and above all Aristotle. They contributed to the sum of knowledge. They innovated and communicated.
Avicenna, along with Averroes, the most important philosopher-scientist, writes medical textbooks which continue to be studied in Europe well into the 17th century because there is nothing comparable in existence. The decline of this cultural and scientific flowering goes hand in hand with the growing power of orthodox theology. Aristotle's logic, one of the keys to scientific knowledge, is forbidden by the clergy. Philosophers become objects of contempt. The designs of Arab ships are copied by the Spaniards and Portuguese. Islamic knowledge is adopted. Around 1450, Europeans venture out into the Atlantic using Arab technology. Islamic and Arabic culture, a mighty structure on the foundations of our holy scripture, the Quran, creates masterpieces of architecture, technology, and art because it understands how to turn Mediterranean culture to its own advantage.
Die wichtigsten Zentren der antiken Wissenschaft waren ja gar nicht mal in
The most important centers of ancient science were not in Greece itself at all. They were in Alexandria, that is, in Egypt, and partly in Syria. These were places where one could draw on traditions that were still cultivated in the land that created them. In Europe, it was a little different. Germany or France were certainly not centers of learning in antiquity.
Ja auch in der Antike nicht Bildungszentren gewesen.
Islam has overcome the barriers of clan and race. The Quran is a holy book from West Africa to Indonesia, a mighty culture. Its decline begins with the loss of intellectual freedom in the Middle Ages, with theological fossilization. Europe has much to thank Islam for. Spain flourished under the Umayyad dynasty from 755 to 1031, and until the fall of the last Islamic enclave, Granada, in 1492. Even so, shortly after the occupation, the Reconquista begins, the attempt at reconquest by Christian forces. The struggle will last for centuries. Islam in Europe. For centuries, Muslim culture is a dynamic presence in Portugal and Spain. There are many unknown influences and features held in common. The Arabs bring chess to Europe, knowledge about gardens and agriculture. Their architecture contributes to the Gothic style, and Sufi mystics will later even influence the rules of the Jesuits. During the Umayyad period under Islam, Jews, Christians, and Muslims lived together in peace. Christians are permitted to practice their faith. Islam respects both the Christian and Jewish religions, and in the Far East extends the same tolerance to Buddhism and Hinduism. Arts and crafts profit from Arabian knowledge. Damascus steel is just one example of Arabian skill in the working of metals. One of the most remarkable cultural sharings is knighthood, the ideal of chivalry held by Muslims and Christians of the early Middle Ages is very similar. Even the notion of romantic devotion to a distant, unreachable lady is probably an invention of early Arabic poetry. The culture of the troubadour, from the poetry to the music, has its origins in Baghdad and migrates to France.
Ja, also es gab schon ein Ritter-Ideal und das findet man eben gerade
There
auch
was
bei
a common
diesem
basis.
syrischen,
A good example is the Syrian Usama ibn Munkit, who was himself a knight, and used this fact as a basis of understanding in his meetings with the Franks. He had a lot of respect for the Franks, because they were brave, and because they also represented this ideal of manhood. They met, and in this context felt very close to each other. He tells of many knights to whom he felt really close, like brothers. He calls them my brothers, my friends.
Richtig nahe stand und die als Brüder, als mein Bruder oder mein Freund bezeichnet.
Nevertheless, for centuries the struggle is for domination, for the final victory over the enemy. Muslim culture is fought and defeated. Only then is it given due appreciation.
Man kann sagen, dass nach Bagdad sicherlich Cordoba eine der
After Baghdad,
glänzendsten Städte
Cordoba was
dieser
certainly
Zeit
one of the most splendid cities of the time.
christliche
For
Norden
example,
zum Beispiel,
in the 10th century,
ein
a
Mönch
visitor
aus
from the
Lothringen
Christian north,
ist
a monk
im
from
10.
Lorraine,
Jahrhundert
travelled
nach
to
Cordoba
Cordoba.
gereist, wohl
He was
als
probably an envoy of
Beauftragter
King
des
Otto I,
Königs Ottos I.
and he's
und
impressed
ist
by the city's
beeindruckt
splendour,
von
its
dieser
size,
Pracht, von
and
dieser
also, it must be
Größe
said, by
und
the
von
power of the Caliph
dieser
in Cordoba.
Gewalt, allerdings auch des Kalifen in
However,
Cordoba.
the processes of cultural exchange are not so marked in the 10th century during the time of the caliphs. It's not until after the Spanish Reconquista, the reconquest of the Iberian Peninsula, which is mostly concluded by the middle of the 13th century, that we find a major process of cultural and literary exchange in Toledo or in Saragossa. But in other cities too, works of antiquity, which had previously been translated in Syria, are now translated back into Latin with the help of Jewish translators. And so the whole of Aristotle finds its way into the universities, which at the start of the 13th century are just beginning to flourish in the Latin
An
West.
die Universitäten, die ja zu Beginn des 13. Jahrhunderts dann im lateinischen Westen aufblühen.
In Spain, the Muslim inheritance intermingles with the Christian culture. Europe can thank Islam for the return to its ancient roots. But there is another inheritance, a terrible one. Terrorism is invented in the 12th century by a fanatical Islamic splinter group called the Assassins. Their leader is the legendary Old Man of the Mountains, Hassan ibn Sabah. The headquarters of the Assassins lies in the inaccessible Iranian mountains. Ibn Sabah is the commander of this radical Shiite group. The Assassins have sworn an oath of loyalty unto death to their imam, and are held responsible for several hundred murderous attacks. Among them, murders paid for by Christian crusaders.
Man darf eben nicht vergessen, dass die ganze
One shouldn't forget that the sect of the Assassins claims legitimacy from the eldest son of a caliph from the end of the 12th century. Nizar, the Nizarids. They fought in support of this caliph, who claimed total power, including religious power. And before him, there were several Fatimid caliphs, who declared themselves to be Godheads incarnate. They were literally worshipped.
A personality cult for suicide killers with its headquarters in the fortress of Alamut. Marco Polo relates how the assassins used a trick to recruit young men for their sect. The youths were given wine to drink which had been spiked with hashish. Soon they were in a state of intoxicated rapture. Then they were taken to the assassins' garden at the fortress of Alamut, where they were briefly allowed to enjoy all the temptations of the Muslim paradise. More was promised them as soon as they had carried out a murder for the sect.
Terror funktioniert ja eigentlich so, dass man durch Abschreckung den Gegner dazu bringen möchte.
Terrorism can be defined as intimidating one's opponent until he does or doesn't do certain things. Accounts we have about Rashid ad-Din Sinan, for example, how he dealt with Saladin, a contemporary, who was very powerful, indicate that Rashid ad-Din Sinan used a series of carefully calculated actions of this kind to dissuade Saladin from conquering the Ishmaelite territories.
Davon abzubringen, die ismailitischen Gebiete zu erobern.
It is told that Saladin awoke one morning to find a dagger and a message beside his bed, a warning not to go to war against the Nizarids. The terror raged for 200 years. It was finally the Mongols in 1256 who destroyed the fortress of Alamut and killed all the assassins. War and terror in the name of Allah are not the inventions of our present age. Then, as now, terror in the name of Allah is an abuse of Islam.